Hello, friends. What a way to start off a video, huh? This is. I just love this picture so much. Anyway, so I was on Twitter and I was looking at this really interesting thread. So basically, somebody was being whiny about Steven Universe art sizes and stuff like that, and then somebody else made the clapback, really interesting Twitter thread talking about animation stuff. You can check this out if you want. So I think that there's a bit of an answer in the middle, because the way that this thread kind of implies things is that, oh no, animation being inconsistent is always both interesting and understandable. Meanwhile, the other one is saying that, like, oh no, it's the worst thing in the world that it's inconsistent. And it's like, no, neither are exactly correct. I'd say this person kills Carrie is more correct, but neither of them is fully correct. I have a couple of, you can go through this because this is all very, very interesting stuff. It's really cool about how animation works. But some of the things that this doesn't take into consideration is and I'm just going to be scrolling back and forth. Don't even try to bother reading it. I'm just doing this to make it look a little more interesting. Part of what this doesn't take into account is that what's interesting is that it talks about how, like, oh, here's the way that Adventure Time is able to make everything seem a little bit more like charming and unique. But Adventure Time and a bunch of the other examples are not exactly the same as the way that Steven Universe works. Like Cow and Chicken being a little bit off model when the whole thing is supposed to be goofy, that doesn't actually, like, lend itself to anything. Nobody's gonna care because it's always supposed to be, like, goofy and stretchy and weird and stuff like that. Steven Universe was a show where, like, going by the twist at the end of the first season, the whole point was like, oh no, a lot of these little details, man, a lot of the little things, part of it was just how pretty the animation was. Oh, there was so much of a focus on the animation that, like, it would get people starting to theorize and wonder about different stuff after you see, like, oh, hey, wait, why is this thing like this? And they pull out a surprise at the end. It's just like, oh, the reason it was like this was because of this thing. It's not the same as, like, the Ninja Turtles cartoons where they were super rushed and cheaply made, and there was some care put into it, but, like, the turtles would talk in different ways because of the way that the animation studios would be different. Like with this example that was shown with the Tiny Toons episode where Elmira is two different, totally different, like, characters almost. And again, that's also a testament to how strong her design is, that you can still tell it's the same character despite looking almost totally different. But I think one of the things that really kickstarted this being an issue, not just because everybody loves to try and complain about stuff unnecessarily, is that stuff like this is fine. This isn't something to complain about. If you're complaining about this kind of a difference, it's stupid. Yeah, it's stupid. You shouldn't be. This is fine. And I do love the way that off-model stuff looks. Quote-unquote off-model. The person down below says, what is it? Off-model is a misnomer. Yeah. Because you don't want it to look like Family Guy. That looks like garbage. And there's a certain stiffness to it, to certain shows. Like, this show was very, very stiff, even though it was still pretty good. This show was pretty cool in the way that it managed to be a cheaper made show that still had so much love and put into it and redrawn so much other stuff that became really, really good. Like, it could have easily ended up like the ones that had a lot less effort in the earlier days that were just for selling toys. But this My Little Ponies turned out great. Teen Titans Go, and then Gumball is fantastic. Gumball has so much work that goes into the animation that you barely even notice, that it's fantastic. But this show is supposed to be very silly and very cartoony. What was cool about My Little Pony was that it looked like it was going to be a stiff flash show, and then they would animate extra scenes, and they would, like, do a little extra animation in certain spots when a scene had called for it, so it would look a lot cooler. So, like, they knew when to do the scenes more seriously, but with Steven Universe, like, Peridot I think is the best example of this. There will be scenes that are rather neutral or Not silly like Cow and Chicken, and with Adventure Time and with a lot of other shows, they'll change their designs based off the emotion that you're supposed to be feeling. So if you want Peridot to be a gremlin, you'd have her be extra tiny and her hair is super enormous. And then it's just like, oh, yeah, that's perfect. You want her to be more comedic, then you'll make her like that. You want her to be more serious, then she'll look like this. But the thing is, the show didn't actually embrace, quote unquote, going off model the way that it said it was. It just goes off model. So you'll have a more serious scene, or a scene that's just not necessarily supposed to be like, if you did this Peridot for like a reaction, like the way that it shows Finn in the thing above, then like that's totally fine. Like Finn has a whole wide range of emotions, and it's perfectly conveyed with the different art styles that look like this. Like the thing is rounded, but it's all curled in, like he's afraid and kind of tucking backwards. Here he's just a happy, pleasant lump. Here he's rather confused, and it all works very well towards what it's trying to be. And here, this is just these kinds of changes. This is just fine. This works very well. These other scenes, like, you barely even tell anybody complains about Jasper, because the emotion is always conveyed correctly based on however she's drawn. It always feels like it's correct with however she's supposed to be. Like this is totally fine. The way that her hair is different depending on who animates it, it allows for a lot of variety and it looks interesting. So this isn't really a problem. And the fact that like Steven, like one of the issues is that as the show went on, like Steven gets taller. He looks a little bit different overall, and that's an important part. And what this thread also leaves out is the fact that like they bragged about how all of the characters are consistent to one another in terms of their heights, even if they aren't consistent in height. Like here, the animation is important, but not only is the animation beautiful to look at in Lilo and Stitch, but at no point is him being very slightly off model in any of these scenes actually important to anything. Like I believe the person that he is off model, but I can't even tell personally. It just feels right. The same thing goes for other characters like Bugs Bunny. It feels right whenever he just does something wacky, because that's the whole point. But when Steven Universe is trying to do something serious and they are strangely off model, like Connie just looks like a Funko Pop figure in this scene. And I believe they were just kind of talking next to each other. I think this was on his Steven's birthday or something, when she's just like, oh, I don't know, or something like that. It's not like her head just grew in size. And there were episodes like the one where Steven is telling the story with Garnet and whatnot, and like if you wanted to have their heads grow huge in that setting for the emotion, you totally could. You could do that in Teen Titans Go. But Steven Universe keeps its characters a bit more consistent. And I think one of the other issues is just that they bragged. The people behind it were bragging about how, like, oh yeah, well no, they're always consistent to each other. Meanwhile, what this doesn't seem to show is that, like, Lapis is sometimes the same height as Pearl, and sometimes she isn't. And another thing is that, what is it down here? This picture is mostly used as a joke to show how Peridot continuously shrank, because this is an important design thing. This was important to the show, where she loses her little finger robotic parts, and this kind of thing is important. You're supposed to look at the animation and go, oh, did you see the little line over here? Do you see how this is a slightly different shade than the other parts? That's actually important, because it turns out she was just wearing armor the whole time. So people are like, oh man, that's so cool, you gotta look at that. And then you see her hair, and then what a lot of people, I think this is one of the things that really started a lot of the ball rolling in this area, was that you see her hair, and it starts to like break apart a little bit here and there, where there's a fray every so often. And a lot of people were hoping that, oh, it starts off as a triangle, and then just like how there are subtle differences in Steven's overall proportions, where he gets a little bit taller and looks a little bit older, you can still have it look different from episode to episode, but you still have to have the feeling correct. And Steven Universe doesn't get the feeling correct in all of the scenes. part of why I still don't care is just that, all of these look good. I just like the look of it regardless. But the fact that they bragged about how this was something that they kept track of, and then they didn't, that is something that is like a fair point. It's not the end of the world. It's not, everything. It's not as big a deal as a lot of people will bring it up to be, but it is a fair point. It's not something to just say like, oh no, it's part of what happens with the traditional thing, drawing more traditionally. But one of the theories was that, Peridot's hair is starting to split, and because she slowly had been progressing as a character and became better, people were thinking, her hair is going to keep splitting more and more and more until it becomes a star. So it'll be like the Crystal Gems general logo of stars and stuff like that. So it looked like that was going to be a subtle animation detail, and you're like, oh man, that's a cool thing. And that we, like, based off the way that they condition you to look at, like, the way Garnet had been designed with the 2 extra gems instead of 1, and they give you all the information you need, and then if you can figure it out by paying attention, that's great, and if you don't, then you get extra surprised. But it was such a good, well set up twist that it seemed like they were going with that in terms of little details. Steven Universe is a show where these little details are very, very important, and then they just don't care. Like, they don't change Peridot from one scene of being more serious to like this, and then she's supposed to be extra gremlin-y, so she's extra small. They'll have a scene that's a little bit more serious, and then she'll be running around like this. And again, it's also not like in, if you're going to do a proportion change like this, a show that really embraced it was like My Life as a Teenage Robot, where when characters went extra tiny, it's not shown in this, they would they would have like a special model for being super far away when they'd be super tiny. So it would just be like a stick figure, basically, of the characters with a cute little smiley face, and then they'd just be running around at a distance instead of just like a random other blob. Like there's one scene of them running, the main characters running up a tower, and they just have a cute little happy face drawn on them while they're tiny. But again, the point of that show is to be much sillier and goofier. It's not that Steven Universe can't be, but you look at this scene and you imagine like, her head is growing extra huge. You'd imagine it like that scene with Steven and the Pancakes, where his face is deliberately drawn goofy. That's perfect. That is exactly when you should do that. But this show doesn't actually keep that in proportion all the time, because scenes that generally have almost the same importance, like this and this, are still drawn this way. I don't think people would be as sore about it if A, it was more consistent with its inconsistencies, and B, that they didn't brag about how they kept track of this stuff when they didn't. Or C, the fact that, I think I just said that, that the show is about paying attention to some of these details, and they didn't pay attention to it. But the other thing is that it's not the same as a show that's intended to just sell toys that they put in extra work for and happens to be a lot better. It's not the same as those old like Spider-Man cartoons, due to the way that the TV animation was different, the way that they do things overseas. These little details are supposed to add to the charm because they're drawn in a charming way, and the differences are important. Excuse me, the differences aren't important. Totally different sentence. The differences aren't important, but so you look at it and you're just like, that's weird. But what carries it through is like, the writing and everything, and it's all supposed to be a very flexible, squishy universe. Whereas when Steven Universe would do these changes, you'd either have them be consistent in an episode, so generally Pearl would look like this for an episode, or like that for an episode, and the fact that they would change but be somewhat consistent to these other changes is part of them being characters, that, what do you call it? Like, the characters over time, they grow and then they change a little bit, so they look a little bit different. But Amethyst's hair looking the way is one way, and Pearl's hair looking this other way, isn't necessarily as important, or Garnet especially. Where it's just like, okay, the hair is a little bit different from scene to scene, but if it's based off of the emotions you're feeling, who cares? And it's not like Pearl's hair would get more frayed, But, you know, you see something like Peridot's hair close up like this. You see it starting to split here in two different sections. So it looks like each of the triangles are going to split from one, like it's going to split into two other triangles and become a star. You see that, like you'd see this and you're like, oh, it's starting to fray. Oh, it's fraying even more. You go back to this and it's just like, what? That's part of the inconsistencies that this person leaves out of the discussion here, where it's like, it's a different animal altogether. With Adventure Time, him being extra small is important to the scene. This is important for the feeling. This is important for the feeling of this scene. This is important for feeling alone in the woods and trying to be whatever. This is Marceline. It's a totally different thing they're trying to do. Hold on. I wanted to redo this point a little bit better. So, in Pokemon, I'm going to use this as an example. Nobody would have cared if, like, the weird blotchy colors in black and white were slightly different. So if, like, you were in a grass area and then you're on the sidewalk or something, if it ends up still looking like it's a grassy area, nobody would have cared that. They were just random blotches of color. But they would generally change based off of the feeling that you'd have per area. So the city would have it being more gray, and then grassy areas would be a little bit more green and stuff like that. When they added a little bit more detail, for example, in Gen 6, X and Y, they added a little bit more background to the background. So like, oh, you're in this grass area, then we're going to have one or two general grass area things. It's not going to be very detailed, but it's like, here's a field. This is what we have for all of the fields, all the grass areas. Here's one for water. We have for all the water areas. And besides the Kalos League at the end, there wasn't really a whole lot of unique backgrounds that were made for anything. So, and what was also important was that they had it look a little bit nicer. It gave you a bit more of the feel. It was going that little extra touch. And they even went to the extra detail of having, like, oh, there are breakable objects in the background. So you're like, hey, this is a little different of a thing. This appears in this cave area. So not only does it look like a cave, but if I pay enough attention to the background and I use this move to destroy it, then I can get an extra bonus item at the end. So you were rewarded for still paying attention to the background details. So after kind of priming you into stuff like this, you jump over to, like, sword and shield. And when they fully model a much more detailed battle area of a bridge, and then you have a battle on a bridge, but then they have all of the stuff for the grass area, they're trying to pull you into being like, hey, pay attention to this. And then they have it not look consistent. Meanwhile, you're on some other area, and there's some other random smaller bridge, and then they have the same bridge model that was used, but they didn't use it in both of the fights, even though it's the same bridge. And they're like, hey, look at all this extra detail that we're putting in. You want to pay attention to this. We even model, like, the first fight that you have with your rival right at the beginning. Look at that. We modeled all of this stuff. And then they're not consistent later on. The more work that they put into it and the more it's supposed to be, the more it's noticeable when they fail to do that. Especially when it's kind of quote-unquote bragging about how this is important. This is the thing that separates this game from the other ones. Look at how much more detailed this is, instead of keeping it more in the middle. So it kind of applies to this similar situation with Steven Universe, where in most cartoons, when it's a little off model, it really doesn't matter. It's who cares? You know, it doesn't. It's just fine with some things being kind of different, and it's still very charming. But when you invite people in and you put in the extra work for a lot of other scenes, where it's like, no, the look is very important. That's when there's pointing it out is a bit more of a valid situation. Should you still be worked up over it and think like, oh, this inconsistency means it's a bad show? No, Steven Universe is still ultimately a good show. Did it kind of get clunky as it went along? Yes. Did they not plan things out even though they had a little bit more time to write things and they just kept redoing stuff? Yes. Did it help a lot of people? And was it an ultimate good in the world? Did it help push forward more acceptance and representation of LGBTQ plus themes in a way that was much more easily acceptable by a wide variety of people? Yes, it's still ultimately a good thing, despite the fact that it got a little disappointing for what it was really building up and what it was able to work towards. It didn't quite have the best, you know, payoff that it could have been, unfortunately. And that is a valid criticism to have. But even though I'm still disappointed by stuff like that, where it could have been even more and then it wasn't, I'm still happy for what it is. And I'm still happy for what it ended up being. Um, it's, I'm still glad that it exists. Um, Kind of like what Game of Thrones did for fantasy, where it made it a bit more acceptable for even like more jock kind of people to more sports fans, more people who don't really like fantasy stuff to be like, oh hey, look, this stuff can be cool. I appreciate that stuff, even though the ending of that show completely destroyed rewatching it, and everything else that it was working towards basically undid a lot of the point and kind of ruins rewatching it and stuff. But you still enjoyed the ride. I still think it's, it's more fun. I actually still haven't watched Game of Thrones, but I've heard plenty of stuff. I've watched so many videos talking about it. Um, but like watching up to a certain point, then stopping it, and then just imagining how it would end is still better than other stuff. And I believe Steven Universe is a little bit kind of like that as well. But Steven Universe has a bit more of an important impact in terms of cartoon history, in the sense that like it really helped a lot of people in their lives ultimately. Like it really helped make a lot of people, like Game of Thrones is kind of important, but enjoying fantasy and talking about fantasy stuff being more accepted by people, that's important, but not quite as important as, your orientation being accepted by other people. Because you can just not talk about liking fantasy and then you're just fine. But you can't always, completely switch off your orientation in front of people. A lot of people have to live hard enough with that, so it did an ultimate good for the world. I'm still on board with it in that regard, even if there are other topics that it handled in the show that weren't as good. Again, really love like the first half of the show. Before it starts to go downhill. The potential that it led up to was fantastic, but I think that's part of the issue with part of why people bring this up, because there are legitimate flaws, but a lot of people have bad faith criticism towards it, where it's just like, no, I think the show is bad, and here are some actual things that it does wrong, so that means the whole thing is bad. No. Not only does it do plenty of things really well, and then really, really well, but it's an ultimate good for humanity. And not every show can be like that, so it's still a good thing. But you also shouldn't say, oh, what does it matter at all? Like, this has no bearing, and actually you should love all of the inconsistencies, because that means it's charm. And no, especially if it throws you for a curveball, and it's frustrating when they're like, look at how it's consistent, and then it's not. And it's like, no, I think it's valid enough to point that kind of thing out. It's just not important to like dwell on it and curl up all of your anger month after month, being super angry about it. Like, I've seen these arguments before, but once I walk away from this video, I'm not going to be thinking about this much at all. I'm going to just be living the rest of my life. I don't care. But it's interesting enough to talk about. Anyway, back to the rest of the stuff that I had done. I wanted to insert this in between. Yeah, there are certain budgetary constraints. I mean, again, another part of it was that, like, the team started to really lose focus, and they took so long to write more stuff and plan stuff that it's like, it wasn't the same as the cartoons that were just mass-produced, and if they happen to be good, they happen to be good. This one had a lot more time going into it, so it's like, the animation issues being slightly different based on who's doing or whatever, it's a different, it just feels like it's a different beast, where it's like they could have tried a little bit harder. I don't know. So I think it just kind of lands somewhere in between for these, where it's like, I love the look of cartoons being squishy and different, but like with SpongeBob, even though they would be different in other things, they would generally have, like, oh, when Plankton's hand is or Patrick's hand is out, it's supposed to look like SpongeBob's hand through a like a tissue or a cloth or something like this. And sometimes he can have a thumb, and sometimes he doesn't. It all depends on what's funny in the moment. Like, it has a much more flexible universe. I'm repeating myself, but again, here, like, it doesn't even matter. I wouldn't have even known it was different. And I do think it's really cool to be able to find which animators have which little quirks for everything. That's really cool. But again, the fact that they bragged about how, like, oh yeah, all of the characters we do have, like, the reason why Pearl and Lapis would change is for no reason. There is no reason. And they would talk about how great it is that, like, oh, Lapis is always going to be shorter than Pearl. Even if they're different heights, like, you don't game theory, pixel measurement, all of the heights based off of the tree. They'll be different depending on the mood that they're setting. Like, what is it over, where's the image? Like, no. Where's the thing? Come on, there's the other picture. Oh no, I think it's at the top, right? Yeah, like, Steven being extra tiny compared to Garnet, this is more important because Steven's supposed to feel very small and she's supposed to feel like she's, more handling things. This is just fine with them being, like, Steven being a little extra shorter in a particular scene. But when you're like, oh no, Steven before he's grown up always has to be at the hip, and it isn't even just like, oh, a general guideline to do this, but you can change it if it's funny, like with SpongeBob, which even has its own flexible universe. It is even trying to be more consistent with itself. When you're talking about that, it's like, all right, come on, man. You're not even following what you're doing. Because again, I like the look of both of these paradots. They're both very funny, but again, it needs to kind of serve purpose, and so often it won't. Like this Peridot, the face isn't just what goes along with Peridot for, like, a reaction. There's nothing wrong with off-model, quote-unquote, animation, because going off-model can be very fun if you're doing it in a way that's much more meaningful. Like here, Cow isn't really doing anything, so Cow being more on model is fine. Here, Cow doesn't understand what's going on, it's just extra derpy, so drawing Cow extra derpy is fine. Here, the smugness and having Cow be extra long in certain, like, her nose and everything just squished out adds to the smugness. And here, Cow feels out of place, so the animation is a little extra out of place. It all fits, it all feels right. Whereas again, here, even though the seriousness is still a little bit sillier in this scene, they're supposed to be, like, as serious, and it just doesn't quite work as well. Like, it's just little things. It really doesn't matter ultimately. I still appreciate what this person has to say, and I think that there is a valid argument on both sides to make regarding there's a bit of an issue with the animation when that's supposed to be important, but other times when it's just like, I don't care. And ultimately, I really don't care, because I still think it's fun, and I still think the ways that they designed it are still interesting and fun. But this person seems to really not see the way that the Crooniverse, the crew behind Steven Universe, kind of dug their own graves, talking about how they have certain general rules that they keep consistent, and I didn't even keep those consistent. That's a bit more of the issue. But again, it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Who cares? It really doesn't matter. And here's an interesting one over here. Look at this. Look at this, based on the different characters of, I haven't scrolled all the way down for some of the other responses, but look at this. This is so interesting. Look at how cool they are, just drawn in different ways. You could just draw them however. You know what? It doesn't matter. Who cares? As long as they're drawn in a cool way, that's fine. It's fine. It's not like that episode of Dragon Ball Super where they were super rushed. But even then, that's a bit more of an example where it's like, yeah, who cares? because they were super rushed to get out. They barely had any time to animate. Those poor animators did the best they could. So Goku looking like he's melted, in the fight scene, that's understandable. Although they did go back and then redid the episodes where he looked better, or like he's fighting Beerus or something on the King Kai's planet. But another thing is that in order to get this super or this slightly more realistic-y look that anime has, of course there's going to be a lot more attention that goes into the main thing overall. So having it look different from one scene to another, this is a bit more excusable for the change in animation. Again, you don't have the crew talking about how important it is that, oh man, you can see every single one of the, or not every single one of course, but her hair is so important that it has all these little frays in this angle, and then have it look like this in other angles. It's like, no. They do this for the action scenes because they have it in a different studio so that it looks good. And then in more calm scenes, there's more like silly, you'd have them look more like this. And then that's the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, you gotta be more understanding. When you brag about how important it is that her head is, not inflated like this, and then you have a different thing. This is a fake example that I'm saying. That this isn't a real example. When you're bragging about how these are supposed to be the same and they're not, then it's a different story. Am I making myself clear? Like, these changes, they don't matter. As long as Steven looks slightly more mature going through the series, which was important, that's fine. You can draw them however they want. But when Peridot is very important design-wise to see that the slight inconsistencies have something meaningful to talk about her character, and then you go back on it, that's not as good. So that's all I have to say, and I think I've said my point more times than I needed to. Thank you for listening to my ramblings.